Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for signing in. I'm with Mason, co-founder of Grateful, and we're talking about Tronc and tipping and all good things around that, and in particular the recent changes around the legislation in the place. Mason, thanks for joining us. Why don't we start with a quick introduction, like who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Yeah, so I'm Mason. I'm one of the co-founders at Grateful. Grateful is a modernized Tronc and cashless tipping platform. And I guess our value add, the reason we do what we do, is all around modernizing tipping for a happy business. So it's all around giving team members more transparency in today's cashless society on their tips and Tronc earnings.
And why do you get into this space, Mason? Like, what drives someone to go and start a business in this space?
Do you want to hear the full story, or
Yeah, absolutely. Give us the full story.
Cool. So my partner and I had been over in America. It was like late 2021. We'd come back over to England, and we were in Harrogate, which is not too far away from where we live. And we're in this restaurant, and there was one person that was like super smiley, really attentive, really, really helpful. And then someone else that wasn't so as much. And obviously we just come out of COVID. I'm a big fan of using these challenger banks and having like a really good digital experience. And then I'm not using cash. I wanted to let the lady know how grateful we'd been for the good service. And I wanted to know that my tip had gone to her. So transparency from a end user customer's perspective.
Yeah.
And I also wanted her to be recognized and be further motivated. So I think it was all around initially coming from a customer standpoint, but then as we sort of got deeper ingrained into the industry and understood the value adds and everything like that, it's opened up, I guess, to so much more possibility from a value add from a business's perspective. And then also we've sort of developed the platform into the Tronc side of things as well. So why we do what we do is really around creating more transparency for people in that whole tipping process. But then from an industry perspective, it's like, how can we modernize that and utilize technology to make people's life easier, basically? And I'm like super impatient with all walks of life. And, if I can have tech that's useful and that's going to help me and actually add value, then, I'm all for it. So that's probably the thesis of the business as a whole.
And what does a typical scenario look like for you? Like when you step into a new customer organization, like what are the problems that they're grappling with?
I think it depends on the type of business, right? I mean, you'll know better than anyone that every hospitality business is different. Every business has got its own quirks and details. And, we've got owner operator businesses that we work with all the way up to high-end SME enterprise businesses. I think sort of assessing it on a case-by-case basis is, where we sort of come into our own from an understanding perspective and how we can solve those pain points. But, from a sort of owner operator perspective, it's like, how can we make their lives easier and take the headache of tipping, Tronc, the legislation off their plate and give them that peace of mind so that they're spending more time on the business with revenue generating activities. And then for a bigger business, it's how can we formalize those processes? How can we put in set objective based metrics and procedures to ensure that they are compliant, making sure that they're streamlining operational efficiencies. But across the board, really, no matter the size of the business, it's all around that people first initiative as well. So giving people more transparency and understanding over their tips. So I think the sort of pain point twofold is that from an operator standpoint, but then from a team member's perspective, no matter where you're working, people want more transparency on things. And I think, again, we could go on for ages and talking about this and, people's psychological aspects of modern day society and what that looks like. But tipping is such a emotive topic. A, making sure that we get it right, but B, making sure that people have got the understanding of where it's coming from and how they can earn more and how it's equitable and fair and transparent, really.
Well, look, maybe let's dive into some of those in turn. Like there's the most obvious bit, there's a compliance piece, right? And everyone's aware that the legislation's just changed. Like, look, for people who are like not so close to this, can you just give us a quick summary of like what's changed, why it's changed, and the impact of that?
Yes, I think the new Allocation of Tips Act that came into force on the 1st of October was all around ensuring that the industry has got fair and standardized practices across tip allocations for businesses that are receiving tips. Now, predominantly, by law and effect, that has meant that it's hospitality industry as a whole, but other industries like hair and beauty, for example, are industries that do take tips as well. So it's really around creating that standardization and fairness, making sure that businesses aren't being discriminatory, making sure that team members have now got access to certain pieces of information, which I think in the long term is going to be great for the industry from a retaining people within.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the main points at a high level are giving more transparency, creating standardized and fair processes that aren't discriminatory, making sure that team members have got access to funds within a certain time frame, and also meaning that sort of inclusion of other people who weren't sort of historically included in Tronc schemes, like agency workers, for example.
So also,
And obviously no deductions, which is the most important bit.
Yeah, very good. So there's obviously a compliance piece to this, and from like your customer's perspective, like people obviously want to be compliant with, like, let's be honest, the minimum hassle possible to keep run a compliant scheme. What about from an organization's perspective, the sort of more cultural aspect to this? Because, like, you know, as a sort of outsider to this, I think Tronc's really interesting in that, you know, if you talk to people like Tronc, it's like you get that headache face, you know, like everyone's like, oh no, like it's a pain, but actually, you know, go back to where you started your story. Like there's that thing of like someone's giving a tip because they want to like, without being cynical, there's a reinforcement of a positive behavior. There's a cultural piece about saying that's important both to the customer and the team member, all those sorts of things. Like that seems to get lost for lots of people in just the admin burden of making it work. So like, how do you think better organizations see Tronc and see Tip-In in terms of how it sits with their culture and their brand?
I think how they see it, again, not to be really unhelpful or broad brush, again, it depends massively on the business. I think from we're in this really interesting time where, you know, historically as an industry, people have received cash and you've got tips, you know, every night, and you've kept your tips, and sort of like as technology has evolved, tipper and card machines have become more commonplace, service charges become more commonplace, and it's the processes have moved on, but the tech hasn't sort of like brought itself up to speed. So I think from a cultural perspective, it's more around how to view that as a motivator rather than just a standard process that sits under the layer of everything else.
Yeah,
I think it's what we're trying to do from a cultural perspective is how can we give this transparency to team members to then help them or empower them to go the extra mile, and then it's from both sides really. But I think that's where the gap is from a cultural perspective.
And you talked a lot about employees and their like what desire for transparency and that sort of thing. What else? Like, are there other things you're seeing change? Like, I know there's a lot of conversation in the industry about different generations at work, different expectations at work, different needs, those sorts of things. Does that play out in the tipping space or?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about tips at the end of the day, like they're arguably one of the most emotive and important pieces of working in hospitality, because, you know, your base salary is your base salary. You more or less know what you're going to get each period anyway. Your tips is all dependent on the cumulative effort of the team that you have, you know, worked with at a site for a particular amount of time. And I think then because there is that potential for fluctuation each period, and it's not necessarily guaranteed, it's all based on performance, business performance, the amount of time that you've put in, that sort of from a transparency piece itself is really, really important. And just looping back to one of your first questions around what the pain points are, is that people are asking loads and loads of questions around the time for payroll, because they're experiencing massive shift latency, because they're working for 4, sometimes 5 weeks at a time, and then they're getting just one line in the pay slip at the end of the period to say, this is what you've earned, this is all your hard work, there you go, without any prior context and understanding of everything. And I think if we sort of translate that to like modern day now, everyone's so used to having data at the fingertips whenever they want it. You know, you've got apps that you can track your food, you can track your sleep, you can track your bank account. Everything's all instantly available there to you. So it's like, why can't we take those learnings from tips and bring that up to speed, really modernize that process? So I think younger people are becoming more savvy around how to get that information, how to request that information. So that's where the sort of platform lends itself quite nicely to.
Yeah, I think if you look at it in the sort of the broader context of like a people operating system, you know, like how you pull all this stuff together to try and push your business forward. One of the things that always strikes me as a bit of a missed opportunity is we've not really tightened up the feedback loop between getting a reward and what it was for, and perhaps more importantly, like what are the driving factors that did or didn't get good performance. So it's like he's kind of wasting a reward, if that makes sense. Like, because we make it too difficult for people to appreciate you got that for that, and if you want more of that, how do you do it?
It's almost like a bit of a disconnect. You know, like you guys, you're the plumbing of the HR tech stack, right? But if you can use technology to close that loop and actually give people that feedback on you've done well and you've been rewarded because of this reason, that's where it can be really powerful. And I know you talk about that quite a lot, really.
I just think there's like, Tronc's one of those really interesting ones. It's like you know, if you create a really simple thing, like what you've done is create a system where you're creating a financial reward about a behavior you want to see more of, right? So in that sense, it's like, this should be a really great thing. And yet you see organizations sort of tie themselves in knots with Tronc schemes and like, it's like the classic one, like, you know, if you want to talk about it, it's not that, no, we just don't want to go there. We don't want to lift that rock up.
That was one of the other things, right, that sort of like spurred me on, because I was like, you know, something needs to happen, because, you know, you'd speak to team members and you say, oh, you know, I would quite often go into a restaurant and say, are you going to get this tip? And they'd be like, well, and like the sort of energy would slump. So I think, you know, I sort of harp on all the time about empowering individuals, but it's actually also about empowering the businesses as well, because there's so many different moving parts, and Tronc touches so many different aspects of the business. It's people, it's ops, it's HR, it's finance. Naturally, businesses will just want to put something in, make it work. And if it's running, then it's fine. It's like, how can we empower those businesses to give this information back to individuals? Again, like you talk about, is to close that sort of feedback loop. Is they're being seen to implement people first initiatives. That's going to help with retention, and retention is going to drive better motivation.
I think that's it for me. It's like, okay, I think the legislation is pushing people into a place where, you know, if you're being harsh about it, you should really be doing this anyway, right? The level of transparency, like not holding things back from people, those sorts of things are all good things. I think with the transparency, though, it's like, okay, how do you now build on that? So you've got the as you say, the feedback loops, the reinforcement loops. So you're actually using what's now in place to try and drive the behaviors, try to drive the culture that you actually want to see, and that people understand, like, this is what you can do to influence this number, which I just think is lost at the minute. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really cool parts of the platform, and there's some even more exciting things that we're sort of bringing further down the line. I mean, it's sort of a very exciting time for us at the moment. But in terms of that level of transparency, is like a team member can go in and see that macro level data, and they can see they're being part of something that's bigger. They can see the overall amount of tips and gratuities and Tronc that's growing in that place of business that they're contributing to as the period goes on. So again, we're proactively pushing that information to team members, which is now something that employers need to provide upon request. So if we're proactively pushing that as part of this people first initiative, that in itself can drive better behavior. But then they're also being able to like delve down into more detail on, you know, what the cash per point value is, what their earning is so far throughout the period. And it's giving them that level of indication from a transparency perspective to drive that better behavior ultimately.
Yeah. So what's your vision for Grateful? Like, where do you see the product going, and what's it going to be looking like in 12 months time, 24 months time?
I mean, features wise, I think we're hell bent at the moment on like making the best platform possible for the people that are actually using it.
Yeah.
We're doing that through, you know, regular feedback sessions and getting feedback, and being obsessed about getting feedback and collecting it from our existing customer base. Because we've got such a wide array of businesses that we work with. We've got owner-operator businesses all the way through to larger businesses. And as a result, every business is going to have different requirements. And if we can sort of cater for that and allow for that level of understanding and sort of base our roadmap off that again is a constantly evolving and changing because of this new legislation and the new requirements. That's one thing. But the other thing is like, how can we build more value in for them?
Yeah.
There's only a certain way that you can go from an adding value perspective to a business, and we feel like we're there. You know, strengthening relationships with our partners that we work with is always at the forefront of our strategy and our roadmap. But from an end user perspective, how can we help them be smarter with their money? So again, there's some cool features that we're bringing out shortly, which will enable people to be much smarter, much more intuitive with their funds that they're getting. Because now businesses, whether you think it's right or wrong, it's a subjective thing, right? But businesses were holding a certain percentage back to try and smooth earning over, because hospitality is so it varies so much month on month. Now that that amount has to be distributed within a certain time frame, how can we then add value from that perspective? Sometimes you're going to get peaks, sometimes you're going to get troughs. So building that value in from an end user's perspective around financial money management, helping them be smarter with that, I think that's really where we're going as well.
Nice. And look, if you were in house at the moment, sat in a people team, thinking about Tronc, thinking about what you should be doing over the next couple of months, what would your top tips be?
I think first and foremost is just that level of transparency and consultation. A consultation is going to look different for every type of business, naturally. But I think as long as you're being seen to consulting with your team members, taking their thoughts, feelings, considerations into account when you are assessing the future of what your Tronc could look like.
Yeah,
I think that's arguably the most important thing. I think from a business's standpoint, using platforms like yours and ours and, loads of other great platforms that are out there sort of solving people problems is always important. Using that as an underlying benefit and how that can then add value to the team, I think is important. But I think sort of first and foremost is that level of transparency and just communication. Because again, I think just sort of linking it back to that level of transparency and understanding from that, younger generation or just people in general, is that fear of the unknown can have catastrophic effects.
Yeah.
So I think if you're being valued and feel like you're being heard by your employer, that actually, I don't have the exact stat, but that actually is now valued as more important in some aspects than the level of pay, which can actually then influence how long people stay at a business or even within an industry, right? I mean, you've probably got way more stats than I do on this type of thing.
You make me laugh. There's a research paper which is people tend to be more preoccupied with procedural fairness rather than the actual outcome of a process. Does that make sense? So they want to. So if you
expand.
So people want to. If you're working for an organization, you want to know that they've run a good process. They've considered the right things and come to a decision in a fair way, even if the outcome of that decision might not be the one you would choose or chose. Does that make sense? So this, to your point about communication, being confident enough to say, look, this is we spoke to these people, this is why we're doing what we're doing, this is what we're doing, this is how it impacts you, is really important. And actually people, as you say, tend to put more weight on, do I work in an organization where the processes, the systems are fair, like there's a fair way of making decisions, even if I don't necessarily agree with how that impacts me as an individual. People tend to value the procedural fairness more than the actual outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And if you actually think about it in practice, it is arguably, it is more important, right? Because it does show that level of consideration. And from an employer's perspective, I think more people now than ever are looking for that level of consideration, understanding, and feeling like they're being heard in the workplace. I think people are expecting more from the workplace. And I think that's where employers have got such a good opportunity to fill that white space and sort of help them feel more valued in the job.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I hope with the legislation, there's people step into the space about talking about it again. Like, this is why we set the scheme up as we have. This is what, this is how, this is why we think it's important. I think, people have got themselves a little bit in knots about the way they set schemes up, running multiple schemes within the same organization, all those sorts of things. And not wanting to talk about what at its heart should be quite a positive thing for a business and its people.
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the other positives around the legislation is that now there's clear guidelines on objective-based rules and metrics that you as a business need to follow or not.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you're breaking the law, and it's very, very clear cut now. And there's less room for operating in the grey, which again is going to have a sort of cascade effect on the industry. And from a team member's perspective, I can't think of any cons of this new legislation, anything that's going to work against them in that perspective. So I think all in all, it should be celebrated. I think it's a good thing, but I do think as well there are a proportion of businesses out there that were doing the right thing by their employees and by the business and doing things by the book, that there's certain intricacies that have necessarily meant that they're not then going to be following the law, which has meant it's a massive restructure. But I think all in all, I think it's a good thing for the industry.
So if we're just looking to wrap up, I'm gonna attempt a summary of your advice, Mason, and you can jump in and tell me I've got it wrong. First thing is you've got to be compliant with the legislation. Legislation. You can't just ignore it. doing that in a way that doesn't put a huge admin burden on your business, I think is obviously important. Doing it in a way that creates transparency, both to the individual in terms of what they get when they get, but also transparency in terms of how you set up the scheme, the decisions you've made around that, and why, for the particular culture that you want in your organization, you've made those choices. And then I guess the last one is like how you actually use it as a positive, rather than just seeing it as like something we have to do in order to be compliant. How can we be using this as a way to drive the service behaviors we want, the culture we want in an organization, the performance in our organization? Have I done a reasonable job of summarizing what you
hit the nail on the head, mate?
There we go. There we go. I was listening.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you for that. And yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's like we don't claim to have this golden bullet that's going to solve all your retention issues and it's going to make your employees the happiest in the world. But I think if we can work with some of the great partners in the industry, like you guys, like other businesses, and we can help provide that layered approach to making sure that people are happy, they feel valued, and they've got that level of understanding and transparency, then I think we're all going in the right direction.
Awesome. Mason, thank you so much for your time. Really
thank
appreciate
you, mate.
it. Thank you so much for the helpful chat. Speak to you again soon.
Cheers.